Oho, ponka moshe, wongide, ombade, wiki edego, ideno hikte wiblon, ponka moshe, hadashmahon, de, wanoche, Larry Wright Jr. Ijajikte habli wishti, usni ponka, si changu lokota bli, wak parling di, wongide, wibli stuba, wibli juba bli, lego. Good afternoon, good morning, everyone. My name is Larry Wright Jr., Executive Director for National Congress of American Indians. Today, before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the passing of a friend and mentor, Chairman Ernie Stevens Jr. Ernie was a tireless advocate for tribal nations. He was a bridge builder whose leadership elevated Indian country and whose generosity lifted up so many of us in this webinar personally. As we gather today to prepare for the possibility of a government shutdown, we carry forward Ernie's insistence on readiness, unity, and protecting essential services for our people and future generations. And now I'd like to turn it over to President of NCAI, Mark McCarroll. Sir?
Before we get into the webinar, I just want to reflect and honor that we lost a warrior and a diplomat on Friday in Ernie Stevens Jr. Um, this gathering, he was always present in a gathering like this, where tribal sovereignty is on the line, where tribal sovereignty is to be advocated, uh, leading the way, whether he was there to say something or whether it was his mere presence. And so, I want to acknowledge that. I want to acknowledge that that memory of what he leaves us, the legacy of advocacy, is something that that we can aspire to and use as a guide as we move through difficult times like this. So, let's double down on our resolve. Let's double down on our resolve, not just to survive the challenge of the time that we're in, but to come through with the resilience of who we are. And drawing on channeling Ernie's energy on this. This is I believe how he would have the outlook for us to move through something like this. It's not just about surviving; it's about being resilient, being strong like that. So, what I'd like to do is invoke for all of us a moment of silence right now to, as we do that, um, honor the relationship and the time and the memory that we have of Ernie Stevens Jr. as a leader among leaders in Indian country, but also to send prayers to Cheryl and all of his family as they transition through this difficult time for them. So please, everybody, a moment of silence to reflect and pray. All right. Thank you very much. And, let's do what we need to do now. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn the floor to you, Larry, to proceed with our webinar.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, President McCarroll. Before I introduce our panelists and get started, a few housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on NCAI YouTube page so that you may reference it later. We're asking, with so many attendees and growing as we go here, that we ask you to put your questions in the Q&A pod located at the bottom of your screen. Not all questions will be answered live. However, they will be recorded in the Q&A pod, and an FAQ document will be created and shared at the conclusion of the webinar. The webinar is meant to generate thought and discussion regarding the possibility of a federal shutdown and the impact on tribal nations. Please don't be shy about putting questions or comments into the question box or raise your hand, and we'll try to get to questions we can respond to throughout the session. I understand that you are all here because of the possibility that the government will be shut down on October 1st, 2025. While we do not know if that will happen, as congressional leaders and the president are negotiating presently, NCAI, and I thought it was important to bring you together to discuss the mechanics of a shutdown, the impact of a shutdown on your communities, and why this shutdown may be different than others, and what you can do to advocate for your tribes with Congress and the executive branch. As a former tribal leader, I know firsthand the concern that you have for your communities in these times of uncertainty. Look to us for guidance, yet when our federal partners fail to act with clarity, it makes our work harder. Though you will not leave this webinar with an answer on whether or not there will be a shutdown, and if there is, how long it may last. My hope is that you will leave with practical information you can take back to your communities so you can reassure your people that you are informed, proactive, and focused on keeping services running and your community safe. We have two incredibly knowledgeable presenters today. Tyler Scribner is a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation and the CEO and Chief Data Officer of Tribal Sovereign Data Analytics. Tyler began his service to Indian Country in 2014 with DOI's Office of Self-Governance and later the Office of Budget and Performance Management. Tyler worked for NCAI for 4 years, where he helped on a variety of portfolios, including the federal budget. Tyler's work continues to feature first-of-their-kind analytics and tools for Indian Country. Elizabeth Carr is a citizen of the Sault Ste. Marie tribe of Chippewa Indians and the Vice President of Intergovernmental Affairs at Cedar Rock Alliance. Liz has worked across national and international platforms to address critical issues such as Indigenous priorities, financing, self-determination, tribal sovereignty, and gender equity. Liz served as a presidential appointee, including as the first ever tribal advisor at the U.S. Office of Management and Budget under the Biden-Harris administration, where she championed funding priorities for Native Americans. She previously held key intergovernmental affair roles at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, Office of the Secretary, leading strategic health policy initiatives and driving systemic change. We thank them so much for being here to share this valuable information with all of us. And with that, I will turn this over to you, Tyler. Thank you.
Chokma, Chinchokma. Thank you very much, Executive Director and Chairman McCarl, for allowing me to speak, and for all of our tribal leaders and elders on the call. Thank you for allowing me to speak. Today, we're going to go over what is a government shutdown, and we'll talk a little bit about which programs may be impacted. How do agencies develop shutdown contingency plans? We'll have Liz talk to us a little bit about that. We'll talk about the agency planning status update and let you know where they're at currently in the executive branch. And then we'll talk a little bit about what can tribal leaders, partners, and allies do for outreach. And at the end, we also have some documents, talking points, and letters for you. So as we've been discussing, the federal government's fiscal year ends in just one day on September 30th, 2025. So if you don't use this QR code on your screen to look at appropriation status bills on the Library of Congress, I encourage you to do it. 12 of 12 appropriations bills made it out of committee in the House, but only 3 of 12 passed the floor. Only 3 of 12 passed the floor in the Senate as well. It's really not unusual for the government to be behind schedule on the budget. Unfortunately, it's only been enacted on time 3 times since 1977, when they switched to the new accounting method. These files on your screen are helpful. So continuing resolutions, generally as a flyby, providing funding mostly at prior year amounts for a specific amount of time. There's typically anomalies that are included, and an anomaly will make adjustments to that prior year amount. An anomaly we see every year are changes to staffing packages for the Indian Health Service for any newly completed facility. And in fact, this administration sent its list of anomalies, which included funding for newly completed IHS facilities. What I really want to draw your attention to is this document on the government shutdown, which I am going to go ahead and make sure everyone has in the chat as well, because we are going to go over quite a bit of shutdown information. But I like to say this is really great for the file. And the file is when you don't quite know what's going to happen, but you do know something's going to happen. So we can put these materials in place so that you can roll them out to your staff immediately, depending on what happens in the next 48 hours. So we'll talk about the mechanics a little bit of the budget so that we can set up the discussion about what's going on right now. Congress enacts appropriations laws that are providing budget authority, which gives the government the power to enter into legally binding obligations. What's important for the budget authority that's provided is it's going to be provided with, a couple parameters for a purpose, in an amount. Now, that amount can be such sums as may be necessary, the indefinite appropriation, like for contract support costs or 105L lease agreements. It can also be a specific dollar amount, like you see as an example on your screen right here. They'll be provided with a time period of use, so when the funds are intended to be used, but they'll also be made available for a duration of time. So some of you may be familiar that even though your money is for a single year in your self-determination or self-governance agreement, it may be available as 2-year money or no year money so that you can close out all your payments on time. The United States has a series of laws that they call the Anti-Deficiency Act. The thing is it's not just one act, it's really a series of laws. And it began in 1870, and I won't read all of this to you, but I will hit the high notes. It shall not be lawful to expend any sum in excess of appropriations made by Congress or to involve the government in any contract for the future payment of money. So even with these laws, the executive branch can deem certain functions and personnel essential as part of a process known as shutdown contingency planning. And of course, like what is a real strict rule on spending without a huge exception? But this exception I personally like a lot, actually, for the safety of human life and protection of property. Certain agencies may be able to enter into obligations. The type of obligation they can enter into is having staff come work without pay. But nonetheless, those programs aren't wholly shut down during the lapse. So programs will be impacted differently depending on how they're funded. So I want to talk two big buckets and then some sub buckets underneath them. For discretionary appropriations, this is the big issue at hand. Most discretionary programs would experience a lapse in appropriations if there's a shutdown. That's going to be the large bulk of funding. However, it doesn't include the Indian Health Service. We'll talk about that in a few more slides, but I think it's a nice segue to your advanced appropriations accounts, your forward funded accounts, so some of those accounts at BIE, and then any advanced funded accounts. Those are not going to be immediately and directly disrupted by a shutdown. Switching over to mandatory funding, direct appropriations would not be immediately and directly disrupted. So an example of a direct appropriation would be the Special Diabetes Program for Indians. And while its authority does expire on September 30th, those funds are dispersed on the calendar year, so there's a little bit of a squishy layover period of a couple months. Even though that program would be expiring, you're not running into the end of funds until the turn of the calendar year. Expiring direct appropriations, that's SDPI, and appropriated entitlements could be disrupted. So some programs, they have temporary authority that's like for a shutdown for 30 days, you can continue to incur obligations to provide your entitlement program. But at a certain point, those authorities run out. And while contract support costs and 105L lease agreements are not scored right now as mandatory, they should be, they're required, they are an entitlement payment, and those will be disrupted. So you may notice immediately, directly could be disrupted, and I want to be as helpful as possible. So trying to package all that could, maybe should, and different flavors of funded accounts. Most tribal programs would be severely impacted by a government shutdown. And even when you have some funding mechanisms in place for staff, for the programs, the staff administering those programs may not be funded. Now, I do want to pause there and say I'm not talking about IHS, and here's specifically why. IHS has 6 accounts that are not funded by advanced appropriations currently, and we understand that they're going to use prior year balances to keep all staff on. So they've got some electronic health record staff, a couple construction program staff, but here is the big issue. And I mentioned this just a moment ago. CSC and 105L lease payments are not included in that advanced appropriation. So that means no payments will be expected, and that a prolonged shutdown could result in a situation where you're not receiving those mandatory obligated payments. Why? Because they're currently scored and treated as discretionary funding. So I think right there, and I know right there is where I would like to switch and pass it over to LC. That's a lot of fun research, but Liz actually has experience in the building doing the real stuff in the most secret agency in government. So I'm quite excited to hear what Liz has to say as well. Liz.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And yes, OMB is an agency shrouded in secrecy. And one of the jobs I had as serving as the advisor to the director was to hopefully open up some of the channels within OMB to tribal leaders so that there's a better understanding of how OMB functions. And so I'll quickly go over what typically happens during the shutdown preparation. Typically, OMB will hold prep calls with agency deputies and other operational and financial teams to discuss contingency planning and provide written guidance in the weeks and days prior to a potential shutdown. Guidance can be found in Section 124 of the Office of Management and Budget Circular A11. However, oftentimes OMB will also send around additional guidance as things move forward and closer to a potential shutdown. So, for example, HHS's current contingency plan notes that their methodology was based on Circular A11 and the most recent iteration of OMB's frequently asked questions during a lapse in appropriations. So typically, agencies are given directions that the following activities are legally allowable during a government shutdown. And those include activities that protect against the imminent threats to life or property, activities that are necessarily implied, activities that are expressly authorized by law, and activities to carry out constitutional duties. So, for example, one of those things would be to continue working on the president's proposed budget for FY 2027 as a constitutional duty. Agencies then typically submit their contingency plan to OMB for approval. So that would include who will be exempt, what programs will continue despite lack of appropriations. And once that plan is approved, OMB will typically post the contingency plan to their website. And so this is where things start to get a little bit outside of the norm in terms of process with this administration. Guidance and transparency of OMB seemed a little bit different this year. The Office of Management and Budget's website, which normally publishes shutdown contingency plans, has been empty for months. And OMB has changed their position and has stated that agency plans will only be available one by one on each of their own agency websites. These contingency plans are really important to be transparent for the public and for folks who are implementing federal programs. And so they typically cover, well, how many federal employees will continue working with or without pay. Agencies did begin populating their individual websites late last week and during the weekend. And so you can find some of those contingency plans on each of those individual agency websites. Additionally, and this is where things start to get very concerning from a tribal perspective, OMB has determined that agencies are authorized to direct employees to perform work necessary to administer a reduction in force process during the lapse of appropriations as an accepted activity that was mentioned in an OMB memo that was leaked last week. It indicates that OMB has directed agencies to plan for deeper reductions in force in case of a government shutdown. This is totally outside the norm of the typical shutdown process. Typically, employees are only furloughed and will plan to return back to their positions when a government shutdown concludes. There are questions about the legality, but it does seem that this administration's OMB is willing to test the waters legally. And I would not be surprised if this is something that comes to fruition if we do enter a shutdown of any significant length. And so we really need to double down and make sure we're advocating for those positions that serve programs that go out to Indian country, that those positions remain safe and are not riffed. And so I'm going to actually turn it back to Tyler to walk through kind of the instructions that we've already seen, and we can go from there.
Thank you. So, as Liz was just mentioning, and let me make sure I'm getting this file in the chat for you as well. Wasn't quite as prepared for this one. But as I look for this file, so there's essentially two prongs for this memo that came out from OMB. And of course, I'm not locating this quickly enough. Mary, could I ask for you to find the OMB guidance memo and drop it in the chat for everyone? Essentially two prongs. So there is the regular prong, the agency lapse plans. We'll talk a bit about that. And then there's also the reduction in force plans. And we'll talk a bit about that. If you are tired of waiting in the chat for the file, I apologize. The QR code will take you directly to it as well. So first leg of it, agency contingency plans, regular determinations of who's essential. So in that memo, they're calling them agency lapse plans. If you're doing other research or reading, contingency plan, shutdown plan, lapse plans, they're all the same thing. And that's because the fancy word is a lapse in appropriations. Those are due to OMB as soon as possible. And the instructions in the memo also request that agencies should not repurpose any balances or assume transfer authority to continue operation. They must request that authority, and it's only going to be granted on a case-by-case basis. So some of that flexibility that was originally there is not expected to be there for each of the agencies. And then even if they have already submitted their plan, again, OMB may reach out in the coming days to require updates. Agencies are directed to, that's the end of information on agency contingency plans that are out of the memo. So we're switching to that second part of the memo right now, which is the RIF plans. And of note is the quoted text here. Agencies are directed to use this opportunity to consider RIFs that satisfy all three of the following conditions is very important. Discretionary funding lapses, that would be most tribal programs. Another source of funding is not currently available. That would be most tribal programs. Now we are going to have some bipartisan infrastructure law, so IIJA and all the ARPA and additional funds that were released. Those programs would be operating, but not your regularly funded programs. And then the last one, which we think is potentially the best opportunity, the policy programs and activities are not consistent with the president's priorities. So we believe at some core level, the trust and treaty obligations of tribal nations are consistent with the president's priorities. So switching kind of to like, what have we heard? So as of Friday, I was chatting with a friend, and federal sub-agencies are submitting their lists of essential personnel to cabinet level leadership. The story that I received was that they were given an initial cap. They met that cap during the day, and then higher ups came back to them and said, no, squish down and get a lower number. And these particular management staff kind of felt betrayed by that activity of continuing to cut. Of note is that we've heard actually from multiple sources now, they don't appear to be taking the RIF threat seriously right now. However, there was some discussion, like maybe it's a phase 2 action, and that unfortunately the OMB guidance memo is kind of worded like a threat, and that if the condition of a shutdown is met, then RIFs will be enacted. Overall, one thing that I've heard from multiple people in budget or management roles is that even though they're a part of the planning, they feel less informed than past shutdowns, but also like it's moving relatively quickly. And I think turning it over back to Liz for what tribes can do.
Thanks, Tyler. One of the things that I would like to mention is that actually OPM released their guidance, their contingency planning today, and did accept HR professionals so that they would be able to conduct RIFs in the event of a shutdown. So, it may be a threat, but we do need to be making sure that we're taking it seriously as we prepare for the next couple of days. And so, since that memo last week was leaked, CTS, the Coalition for Tribal Sovereignty, together with NCAI, has pulled together a strategy to really help protect Indian country from a shutdown, but more specifically from any rifts that could potentially take place. You may have seen an action alert come through last Thursday via email where we urge tribal leaders and tribal organizations to reach out to administration friends to request that agencies exempt all Indian country serving positions and programs, regardless of the agency, from these rifts in fulfillment of the trust and treaty obligations and our unique relationship with the U.S. government. In the meantime, we've worked over the weekend to develop a letter that was sent directly to OMB Director Russ Vought to issue or to request him issuing a directive exempting federal employees serving Indian country from any furloughs or reduction in force actions. Beyond it being the right thing to do, we really leaned in on the premise that taking this step is essential to upholding the federal government's trust and treaty responsibilities. It protects and safeguards life and property with very critical services that Indian country relies on. And it aligns with some of the administration's previous actions to prioritize tribes and tribal programs. NCAI also was able to provide a list of funded tribal accounts that have positions and FTEs that should be protected by our account. And this is a really critical piece of the puzzle because oftentimes federal agencies will assume that only IHS and BIA are the only programs that serve tribal communities, when we know that's not the case. Almost all federal programs and funded accounts impact Indian country in some way. And we may need to make sure that federal agencies and OMB understand that to ensure that those positions are safe as well. So if after a shutdown, that staff is needed to implement programs, are able to get back to work, to disperse resources, provide technical assistance, and more broadly support Indian country. The letter to Director Vought and the attachment I mentioned earlier were sent this morning. Subsequently, we did send out another action alert, and we are urging all of you to reach out to OMB Director Vought and your congressional delegation to request protecting Indian country from any harmful actions, both on a furlough front, but also on in the case of additional reductions in force. Um, as we mentioned earlier, the state of play is constantly shifting. The White House and the majority and minority leaders will be meeting here in about 23 minutes to discuss appropriations. And so, again, we're not entirely sure if a deal will be struck, if they decide to shut down, if we inch closer to a shutdown. And so, the best course of action now is to assume that there will be a shutdown, prepare internally, legally draw funds that you have access to, develop contingency plans for staffing and additional funding where possible. And lastly, reach out to the White House and your congressional delegation. We've provided resources in terms of draft emails, letter templates, and screen scripts for your use. Our intention is to remind those in power that Indian country can't afford a shutdown, that shutting down is an abdication of the trust and treaty responsibility, and that if they do shut down, they need to take prompt action to protect Indian country. And so we're really calling on all of you to take these resources, reach out to your allies and friends and your congressional delegation to really impart on them that this is a trust responsibility, that a shutdown abdicates that trust responsibility, and that we need to be protected in Indian country. And so I'll turn it back over to Tyler.
Oh, I have been trying to drop some resources in the chat for you. I understand that they're also going to be sent out immediately after the presentation. I see your comment that you're unable to open the PDFs. So we're going to have communications that's helping with us put the files into the chat while we do some Q&A. But please know, not only is the session being recorded, it's going to be posted to NCI's YouTube channel, but they also want to make sure you have these resources that we're talking about. The shutdown FAQ, we've talked about a lot, which programs could be affected. So you get these to your staff and kind of think about who would be affected the template letter to send out, and then also messaging on two tracks. I hope the PDF is at least working for some of you all. And as far as mobilizing for who to send, please reach out to your representatives, find your senator. The plan that's being put forward, because of the very small timing window that's going on right now, we know that the shutdown plans are either with the cabinet level agency officials or over to OMB. So messaging OMB is the level that we believe we're at, but then also going to the legislative branch and having them reach across to the administration is what we believe would be helpful at this time. I don't think we have any more materials. I like to say I've always done hundreds of hours more research than ever makes it into the presentation, so there's a chance I can answer your question. I know we've had some in the chat, maybe in the Q&A, so maybe I can just read through those. In the event of a shutdown, if we submit reports or drawdown requests on time, but federal staff aren't available to review or release them, how do agencies typically handle those delays? Are we protected from compliance filings? So I can't immediately speak to the protection from compliance filings. However, I do know that there will be delays inadvertently. One of the things that they do in the past when they've chose who's essential is essentially it's like the awarding official is who's selected as essential. But we all know that you need those programs moved into the appropriate accounts and made at the appropriate version level, and then either directly deposited or made eligible for drawdown. Those functions will suffer. And any funds that aren't programmed for drawdown, there would be delays in getting those funds available for the awarding official to be able to release them. In terms of compliance, I am an attorney, so I don't want to get myself in a bind here. So I apologize on that one. Maybe Liz has a response.
I would just recommend that if possible, if your staff has the capacity to during these really challenging times, to continue to submit your reports and your compliance materials, just so that they're in the inbox of folks when they return to the office. I think we've proven in Indian country that we are resourceful and excellent grantees of the federal government, and we can continue to do that despite a shutdown. So I would recommend that we continue to please submit your reports as much as you possibly can on a timely manner.
So this next one we have in Q&A is interesting as well. During the shutdown period, are we allowed to obligate funds? And when the shutdown is over, request for funds to cover those expenses? It does depend. So there's kind of this world where maybe we're talking about your ISDIA agreements, and then there's a world where we may be talking about different types of grants. I think one of the big cautionary problems right now is before there's a first continuing resolution, there's no new year funding that they're like giving you a partial apportionment or allowing you to obligate and start to do business. So during this initial shutdown, it would be important to reach out to your cognizant federal agency and talk about how the shutdown may affect your programs. In terms of what you're doing generally, like in an ISDIA agreement, where in some ways you're kind of standing in the shoes of operating that federal program, there will be a minimum protection of life and property to be considered. It's so case by case specific that reaching out to your cognizant agency would be very important. Particularly since there's not a first CR. If there's one CR, and I don't want to get too wonky for everyone on the call, they have been doing something called accepted apportionment, where they go ahead and apportion out like 95 or a little bit higher percent of what you got last year. And that in that situation, you would have those funds to operate. You need a first CR for that. So that's why this first shutdown is particularly dangerous.
Before we get to the next question, I'm seeing a number of folks in the chat asking about materials. A lot of the materials that we did mention today are also hosted on the Coalition for Tribal Sovereignty website. So please feel free to visit that website. If you do need the password to get into those resource materials, please email us and we'll get that password to you immediately. Thank you.
I know we have some going in the chat. I want to look at the one in Q&A really quick about Bonneville Power Administration. Would it be affected by the RIF directive? So Bonneville Power Administration, while authorized by Congress, is considered a self-funded agency or fee. It's funded outside of the regular appropriations process. And if I'm thinking back to the guidance memo and it's, essentially it's 3 requirements for where it would apply, I would think they have a funding source running other than regular appropriations, and that would make them not subject. That is reading tea leaves, but I feel fairly strongly for Bonneville Power Administration for that one.
Based on previous shutdowns, that is the case with Bonneville.
That's why it's awesome to have somebody from OMB here with us, formerly from OMB with us. So I did see there was substantive question other than for the chat that I thought I saw here. I'm sorry, I'm looking for you. In case of grants awarded to tribes and other entities, will those grants cease to operate regarding spending, etc.? This is another, it depends. So if you have a multi-year agreement, it depends on how those funds are structured. And remember how I said funds are provided with a period of use and a duration of availability. It would really depend on what your period of use and duration of availability for those funds are. In general terms, so not making it too nerdy, if you're asking like if a standard grant funded by regular appropriations, would it be disrupted in a shutdown? Yes. It would most likely be out of funding authority unless the grant is 1 year of money, but it provides like 3-year agreements or something like that. So I hate to say it depends, but maybe that underscores a reason to maybe reach out to your financial officers and other grants, administrative people, and kind of get an assessment. What are the periods of performance and durations of these various federal awards as you come into a shutdown?
Tyler, I see a question in the chat regarding BIA law enforcement, what it would look like for tribes pending the shutdown. I think that's a really important question because law enforcement is considered, imminent to protect the safety and property. It is likely to be accepted. That being said, because they are not an advanced appropriated agency, they will be doing so without funding. And so those officers, those law enforcement officers will be continuing to work, but they will not be receiving their pay. And so that differs from the Indian Health Service, which received advance appropriations for the first time in 2023. And that was really important because that allows for our IHS facilities and providers to continue to provide services. One, because they should be able to, they are accepted, they are providing life-saving services. But 2, they also will now get paid because they are advance appropriated. So that's another kind of sticky situation, or just it depends kind of answer, because all of our programs are funded in very different ways. And have different types of statutory requirements, that it makes it a little bit difficult to kind of give you a one-off answer for the majority of all the programs that are operating in Indian country. And so it's like Tyler said, it's an it depends kind of response to most of these questions, and it really makes good sense to reach out to your agencies to gather further information.
I have a couple here lined up. The first one is going back to Q&A. Is HUD shutting down? HUD would shut down for Native American programs, your Indian Housing Block Grants, your Section 184 home loan guarantees, your HUD BASH program, and also your Community Development Block Grants as well. So those would be impacted. There's a question in reference to the OMB memo. And then it gives the quotation, with respect to those federal programs whose funding would lapse and which are otherwise unfunded, such programs are no longer statutorily required to be carried out. Are there any tribal programs not statutorily authorized? So yes, you're kind of asking 2 questions here. So what that statement from the memo is getting at is a lapse in appropriations for when the period of use has ended in that budget authority. If So a lot of programs would be impacted by that. A vast majority of the programs would be impacted by that. Again, with the new exception of Indian Health Service. If you're asking, are there tribal programs not statutorily authorized? So it's like, are they no longer authorized to be appropriated? And then each year, when Congress provides an appropriation, it's also considered self-authorizing. An example of that is HUD, Native American Programs, the Indian Housing Block Grant. The Indian Housing Block Grant is not, NAHAS does not reauthorize. I don't interpret the memo to mean thus the Indian Housing Block Grant is no longer statutorily required to be carried out. It could be that they've lost their mind. I think this is about the funded accounts, though, not who's authorized. And I only mean to mention that because it is a nuanced distinction, but one of the things OMB is going after is they don't want to fund programs that aren't authorized by Congress. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that, Liz.
No, I would agree with your analysis there, Tyler.
After October 1st, when the automated system for payments ASAP at Treasury opens again, will tribes be able to draw down funds for previously approved projects, such as NTIA broadband projects? Depends on how the agency has treated your funds in the past. So when I worked at Department of the Interior, if this were your like your ISDIA funds, if you didn't draw those down in time, but then we shut down the system for year-end maintenance, those funds are re-obligated into ASAP for drawdown. But I mention that because it does take a human on staff to move those funds and put them back into the position they were in before year-end closeout. I don't know that every agency de-obligates and re-obligates their funds. I think they would. But it would depend on how NTIA treats its year-end scheduled maintenance, and then whether it needs to be de-obligated or re-obligated. It's a little late for it. I was looking at the calendar. There is, even when the electronic drawdown system is closed, there is a paper drawdown and authorization system. And federal partners grumble when you remind them of that. But if you were really worried about those funds disappearing, there's a chance you could try to force a manual drawdown. Again, that's going to be agency specific. I haven't. We have a question about DOI's contingency plan. We haven't seen it either. So part of the memo instructions was kind of getting on to agencies for being late on their earlier agency contingency plans. And then we also had the intel that we knew at least at kind of like the assistant secretary level, then up to the secretary was where we saw work being submitted on Friday at close of business. So it could be that DOI's is on its way. Maybe they're amending it because tribes are getting to them, but that's just me being hopeful. We have a comment. Please also remember advanced appropriations is helping IHS right now for 2025, but it needs to be passed in the 2026 appropriation for it to continue to help. Yes, even advanced appropriations have a 1 fiscal year timer on it. So if for whatever reason there was a full year shutdown impasse of the government rolling into 2027, IHS would not have any funds in place. What if I just set a huge chunk of my 25 discretionary funding into a tribal construction set aside for a new child care center? So it depends on the identity of the funds that you've moved and put into that construction account, but it's not really that those funds lose their identity, or can, get to be commingled because you've moved them for that project. So how would it impact a new child care center? And I apologize, anonymous attendee, there's not quite enough information. If you're looking to break ground, or maybe thinking about construction is multi-phase, so it's like you do build phase. If you're nearing a build phase, if you have the funds in place from a prior year, you would probably be able to do those activities. But it depends on the type of construction you're doing and whether, for whatever reason, there are restrictions on the use of federal funds to continue that activity. Again, I don't mean to be so wishy-washy. There's a chance, since you've already put those funds in place, and it's kind of like multi-phase funded projects, that you could go on with the appropriate phase, but you would need to check the parameters and use of federal funds for that construction agreement.
And just as a note, this is nothing that we're sharing here. It should be considered or construed as legal advice. So please
Never.
engage with your legal counsel as well.
Yes. If I didn't make my answer clear enough to say you really, really, really must check. Construction is an interesting question. Do shutdowns affect Medicaid, Medicare reimbursement timelines? It could ultimately affect timelines. So while those payments from those accounts are mandatory obligations, the staff to administer all those payments could be impacted. We don't know necessarily in this moment how much Medicare, Medicaid staff would be impacted. That's kind of the story they tell for past shutdowns, is that your Social Security and your Medicare and Medicaid, while they may not be immediately impacted, they would be impacted by not having the staff available to administer those programs. Well, there's a lot of questions in here. Liz, whenever you're ready. No. What entities, if any, are currently focused on taking federal funding tied to service of Indian country out of the discretionary funding system? Where can tribes and allies focus their support to enact change along these lines? NCI and a large coalition of tribes, tribal organizations, and advocates have been pushing to move tribal program funding to mandatory obligations. It could be a type of funding that are called direct appropriations, so they wouldn't be a threat of a shutdown quite like other programs. If you are interested in that, I encourage you to actually please just follow up with NCAI. This issue and the movement towards mandatory is a long-standing battle for Indian country.
I did see a recommendation in one of the chats regarding, or at least a notification that people can request agencies to also hold calls and webinars. That has been a practice in the past. I'm not sure if that's going to come to fruition with this administration, but it is worth the ask. If you have specific questions regarding specific agencies, they're always going to be the best suited to answer your very specific questions. And so just wanted to put that out there as an opportunity as well.
I see a comment in here from Justin Parker as I scroll through about the RIFs at DOI, but I think it's a good point and distinction to make because it is in the rules. Any agency already doing a RIF, those RIFs will continue. And the OMB guidance memo essentially says, but we may follow up and have you further amend that RIF activity. So what we currently understand is it's almost like DOI is continuing with its RIF activity, but it's not doing RIF plus RIF planning. The news we understand is that it's the same RIF planning from a couple months ago. Again, OMB, if they launch the government-wide RIF plans, they reserve the right essentially to ask that the RIF plan be amended.
I'm seeing a question from Phil Constantine regarding whether or not this shutdown will be different than previous shutdowns. And the answer is maybe. We're not entirely sure. Where it's already starting to differ is one, the lack of transparency in contingency planning being shared by OMB, and then also the potential threat for reductions in force. That's never been done before, and so that will really enhance the impacts on Indian country if they are to do RIFs that will impact staff that do serve those programs that provide services out to tribal communities. And so we don't exactly know if they'll be different. We're anticipating that they could be. And so that's why we're really trying to raise awareness around why the rifts will be so dangerous, not only to Indian country, but the remainder of the federal government. Operations would be very, very negatively impacted if rifts were to take place during a government shutdown. And so we do know that there's a potential for the shutdown to be very different.
There's another question asking for a list of personnel that would be affected or could be affected, and who do you contact? I like this question. So I'm going to answer directly for the programs that are identified and then tell everybody how to look at it. So there is sometimes the slightest difference between the funded account in Congress and the org chart for who administers that program in the executive branch. So you're touching on a really important point, which is the staff who administer the programs are sometimes different than those programs. Here's how you find out. So for your WIC program, you need to go to the President's budget request for food and nutrition or USDA. But generally, across the board, you need to go to the budget justifications for whichever agency you want to look at a particular program. They will have how many FTE, full-time equivalent employees, are used to accomplish a particular mission. So that's kind of the missing link where you could take the list of programs that NCI has developed, find your program, go to the president's budget, and you see, well, there's 7 staff in there. And then you could do like a really sophisticated ask to say these 7 staff for the WIC program need to be deemed essential because, and then we believe risk of life or property is probably our best bet at this point.
Tyler, I know we're running short on time, but I do see another question in the chat. Will EPA, IGAP, IGAP programs be affected? Again, this is the answer we hate to give. It depends on how EPA plans to address those programs in their contingency planning. My guess is that yes, they will be, based on my previous experience at OMB.
And I think an important caveat to add to that, further on it depends, but here's a helpful lead. Depending on your audit period, whether you're on the federal fiscal year or if you're on the calendar year or you're on the mid-year, I know a few of you tribes are out there. There could be, different impacts, right? So if you're on the calendar year, you may not have immediate issues or shutdowns. You would still have the funds to obligate for the end of your fiscal reporting period. So looking into what are your accounting periods for these various funds could be one way to look at which funds might be frozen or impacted.
Another question around OVC and OVW and how they will be impacted. I think OVC is unique in that they operate via fees and fines, and so that might be a little bit different than OVW, which is a grant program. Again, the answer is it depends on how DOJ deems these programs. In past shutdowns, they have been affected. Tribes have I don't want to say front paid for, front funded, and then were reimbursed once the government reopened. That's one way that tribes can maintain those services. But again, it's going to depend on how DOJ constitutes those particular programs.
I'd also note that while Congress has always chosen to provide back pay and essentially retroactive anybody who's affected by a furlough, there is no requirement, and it does require an action from Congress.
I see a question from President Starr comes out. Have the area directors received any information on who will be RIFed or furloughed? We're not privy to that information right now, and so we're not entirely sure. Your best bet would be to reach out to DOI and IHS specifically on area director information.
Oh, but we're even adjusting to this new great news. If you mean IHS areas, none of the directors will be impacted. If you mean BIA regions, some of the regional directors could be impacted. There's a chance they're the awarding official. That's why I paused. So ultimately, they may make the list because of all the authority they have as RD. Somebody asked about TTP, Travel Transportation Program. So that's one where we actually encourage you to reach out and contact the Office of Tribal Self-Governance or Tribal Affairs at Department of Transportation. Contract authority from the Highway Trust Fund is counted as mandatory, but it requires a liquidating action to then provide the funds. So we're familiar with the obligation limitation and then its deductions. What's really going on is this kind of two-step, which is, well, we'll call the contract authority mandatory so that you can enter into your multi-year, multi-phase deals. But the ultimate amount is going to be subject to what we liquidate from that fund. So there could be an issue there again with, because there's not like a liquidating action from Congress to make funds available from the Highway Trust Fund, that could mean your FY26 funds are frozen. It may have a different story for your FY25 funds, another kind of construction reason to look out and ask questions with your cognizant agency. It says, but the RIF could happen even to IHS, even though their funding continues in the shutdown. Correct. So technically, the guidance memo gave those three conditions that we talked about. And because IHS has an alternate funding source keeping it open, it wouldn't immediately fall into that category. But I think just to wipe your forehead and be like, well, we're out of clear now, I think is probably the incorrect approach at this time. So ensuring that IHS is not subject to RIFs, I would call still very important. There's a request for information from the chat if we're able to do that. That's going to be on NCAI. Anything else? Are there things I'm missing in the scroll? So I apologize. Lots of messages were coming through. If I haven't answered your message, say, hey, scroll up, and I'll look for your name. So transit, same story for transit. The transit funds are also provided out of the Highway Trust Fund, or the transit fund, the equivalent of the federal trust fund for transit dollars. Transit funds have that same treatment of like where the contract authority is mandatory, but then the spending is discretionary. It takes this liquidation of obligating action in Congress. So your transit program is going to fall in the same category as TTB, your bridges programs, pretty much anything that was in the bipartisan infrastructure law, the bill. Most of those funds are to be out of the Highway Trust Fund or the transit fund, and would be impacted. There are limited funds that were authorized to be appropriated as part of regular appropriations, discretionary appropriations. The nationally significant federal lands and tribal projects, that would be one example where the Highway Trust Fund portion of that program, 50% of those funds are still owed to tribes. That those funds should be administered. The discretionary portion, that program would shut down. There would be no funds for the discretionary portion of the nationally significant federal lands and tribal projects program.
So President Makara mentioned in the chat that we should remind folks that materials are available. This webinar will be recorded and hosted on NCAA's website. You can access the materials that we've discussed on the Coalition for Tribal Sovereignty's website. Again, if you're unable to access those resources and need the password, please email the info box and we'll be sure to get that password to you. And then lastly, I see one more comment about asking about has Secretary Kennedy said anything about continuing to protect IHS from RIFs? it might be a good time to reaffirm. And these are the types of things that we're asking folks to do in our calls of action, right? We are asking folks to, one, remind agencies of their trust and treaty responsibilities. And then also, we can say thank you to Secretary Kennedy for his leadership in the very beginning of the administration from protecting IHS from the rifts, and that we would hope to see that continue moving forward. So thank you for that reminder.
I was just answering one in the chat here. Is there, uh, Mr. Chairman or Executive Director, is there any length or timing? I'm happy to answer questions as long as
Well,
they're rolling in.
yeah, if you have time, we'll I'm sure people would appreciate as much as we can. We'll maybe limit it to the bottom of the hour.
All right. So there was a question about HUD drawdowns, and you talked about how essentially your period of performance for the use of those funds would be outside of this window. That's going to come down to HUD's year-end scheduled maintenance process, and how do they potentially de-obligate and re-obligate those funds. There should be, so in past shutdowns, there is limited staff there. There's one warding official, there's like one finance person, and they do try to truck along. But kind of one of the issues right now is we don't entirely know who will be deemed essential during this shutdown under this administration. What are our goals? What are tribal nations' goals for strengthening economic sovereignty? And do you see emerging digital tools like blockchain as a path to reduce reliance on external finance or governmental institutions? That is a tough one. Anytime I think about currency, I like to think when the United States was still just colonies. And the story is really easy. Unfortunately, it's like, you know, there were 13 different monies, right? And New York thought it had the best money around, or maybe Massachusetts thought it had the best money around. But that was only until there was a national bank and a national currency. And one of the things I worry about kind of fiat currencies and like digital currencies is that they're only hot and worth something until they're not, and something replaces it. So I do think there is a lot of inherent risk in it. However, I do think blockchain technology is it's really a records system. It's a records keeping system and a ledger system. So anywhere you think about good records keeping, I believe potentially blockchain could be helpful. So like your land title records and things like that, potentially in the future, and also maybe money. But just there's always a lot of risk in currency. But thank you for that very difficult question.
I think there's a really important comment here from an anonymous attendee. Please remember this is a really scary time for federal employees on top of all of the regular stress they're going through, because when there's a shutdown, their paychecks also stop. And we totally hear that, understand that, and want to make sure that they understand that we support them and recognize the important and critical service they provide to Indian country, and appreciate everything that they do. And so we will continue to request and work with the administration to ensure that those that serve Indian country are protected moving forward.
I might also mention that, during the last push of RIFs for the administration, tribes were actually very successful in reaching out to their allies and getting those exemptions and protections. So we thank you very much for kind of the sobering and serious comments. We also think there is a lot of opportunity for tribes to reach out and try to limit the impacts, just like we were successful a couple months ago. Can we expect a continued hold on hiring? I think yes. Um, the same requester is asking about contract extensions. I think yes. So if you're potentially any of your contracts or awards are currently on hold, or if you feel like they've been on hold, I don't know anything about the turn of the fiscal year that would necessarily shake those loose. There is some chance. Um, the Senate version of the funding bill for BIA, BIE, and IHS, it makes the committee report binding language. It uses incorporation to bind that committee report language. It could be that if funds were held up, the agency was interpreting that there was no legal requirement for them to administer those funds. So if there was like a demand in a committee report and the committee report language was incorporated. I know there's a lot of ands there, but there is a path to compelling those funds to be released potentially. Now that's not immediately on the board. That's part of the negotiations that are currently stalled and leading us into a shutdown. But there is a policy path for that potentially. Any other comments, questions?
Tyler, there was a question earlier about the Green Book. Can you explain that?
The Green Book is the president's budget request for Indian Affairs programs for BIA and BIE. The Green Book is a slang term that refers to the president's budget request. Anytime you hear about the president's budget, they really mean the whole umbrella. That includes the president's budget in brief, and then also the detailed agency budget justifications. You'll either see those called congressional justifications or budget justifications. In the very special instance of the Department of the Interior, they call it the Green Book. It's just a slang way to refer to the president's budget request. Again, that would be where you find your lists of FTEs, those full-time equivalents, and also the organizational charts so that you could link impacted programs to the staff and offices administering those programs.
Tyler?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
Yep. So on the Green Book, I know at our Unity Impact Week, there was a question about that as well. And I guess nobody had seen I think it was the current Green Book. And I'm wondering if the question or two that came up in the chat had to do with that. I think it referenced the 26 Green Book. I don't know about the 25 Green Book. Anyway, if you have an answer for that, it'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the clarification as well. So the 2026 Green Book for BIA, BIE has not been released. There is top line budget and brief information from the Department of the Interior. However, I do have good news for this particular purpose. Since we're operating under a full year continuing resolution, the amount of full-time employees that are reported in the most recent BIA and BIE Green Books, that's going to be a very strong estimate of how many full-time equivalent employees are currently approved. There could be, mid-year changes where you get an employee approved or you get rid of an employee because of changes. But even though you don't have that latest Green Book, so it is a deficiency of data, if you're looking for who's in charge and how many staff are doing it, the latest Green Book available will get you very in the ballpark, a really good hit in the ballpark. See lots of requests for the materials coming through. We appreciate your requests for the materials. Please do reach out. We feel like the timing window is very quickly closing on the ability to get on that list of essential programs and personnel, or again, to apply that pressure to be exempt from RIFs. So we thank you all for your interest in wanting to reach out and access those materials.
Yeah, and thank you, Tyler. I think this is a good transition here. Want to thank everybody for attending today. Special thank you to Liz and Tyler for your information and taking the time to explain that and answer these questions in real time. Know that our team at NCAI and with the coalition, Tribal Sovereignty, our partners over there, the information that was shared in this slide deck, this whole session, this whole webinar will be posted on the NCAI YouTube page. Please go to the NCAI website. There's a link to the Coalition for Tribal Sovereignty with all the documents that were referenced, QR codes. You'll be able to find those on there. I know there was a lot of requests for the password. You really need to go onto the coalition website and request that, and they will email that website to you directly, and you'll find that information there. But in the meantime, I know our team is planning on going back through some of the questions that may not have been fully answered or were missed, and try to create an FAQ sheet to help follow up with that. But as always, if there's any questions in the interim, please don't hesitate to reach out to us, and our team will do everything that we can to answer as best we can. So with that, President McCarr, I want to say thank you for your strong words honoring Chairman Stevens. And again, Liz and Tyler, for your time, and to our team here at NCAI. I know this is tough times, but we'll continue to advocate as hard as ever on behalf of our tribal nations. And so with that, thank you all very much for joining us today. Gatega, Wiblahan, Sheno. Thank you.